Welcome back to Ben's Book Club. Today, we are diving into the book Good Economics for Hard Times. It's written by Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo. Now, these two are actually a married couple, and they both happen to be brilliant Nobel laureates. Essentially, they are on a mission to rescue the reputation of their entire field. You see, throughout this explainer, we're going to show you that economics is way too important to just be left to the experts, who only care about spreadsheets. Good economics, they argue, is actually all about human dignity.
Right off the bat, the authors share this incredibly funny, yet kind of sobering statistic. Economists are actually trusted less than hairdressers. It's a great icebreaker for sure, but it points to a much deeper truth. Traditional economics really lost the public's trust because it treated people like hyper-rational robots, what they call econs, instead of messy, emotional human beings. We get stuck in our ways, and frankly, we often care way more about our social standing than we do about some random tax credit. Okay, let's dive into this, starting with one of the absolute most hotly debated topics out there, immigration. The authors tackle this one head-on, and they validate that it is completely 100% natural for people to fear it. Why? Well, human psychology is basically wired to view economics as a zero-sum game. Our gut instinct is to think, hey, if there's more for you, there literally has to be less for me. But as we're about to see, the actual data paints a very, very different picture.
When you look at the pervasive political myth next to the actual data, the difference is just staggering. The myth tells us that immigrants inevitably steal jobs and depress wages for native workers. But the reality of good economics, low-skilled migration has almost zero impact on the wages of the native poor. The huge mistake traditional economists made was assuming labor is just like water, flowing to wherever the money is. In reality, immigrants often take the jobs locals simply won't do. And just by living in a community, buying groceries, getting haircuts, they create a whole new demand for goods and services.
To really prove this point, the authors highlight a famous case study known as the Mariel boat lift. So back in 1980, Miami experienced a sudden and massive influx of Cuban refugees. We are talking about a totally unexpected 7% overnight increase in the local workforce. Now, if you look at traditional supply and demand models, a spike like that should have absolutely crushed the wages of local workers in Miami, right? Well, the incredibly counterintuitive reality of human economics is this: that massive 7% influx of people had zero negative impact on local wages. None. The city just absorbed the new workers, the demand for local services expanded to meet the growing population, and the local workforce wasn't harmed at all. It's a really powerful reminder that fear almost always outruns the facts when it comes to economic debates. And that exact same disconnect between fear and facts shapes another massive debate: international trade. The authors offer a remarkably humble mea culpa here on behalf of their entire profession. For decades, the standard economics line on free trade was just incredibly glib. It was always, just open the borders, trade is a win-win for everyone. But if that math is so perfect, why are so many people out there visibly losing? Here is where the disconnect happens. The myth is that free trade creates wealth, and everyone magically benefits equally. The hard reality is that while trade is undeniably good for the average wealth of a country overall, it absolutely devastates individuals in specific, concentrated areas. Think about what happens when a small town's primary factory closes down. The winners of free trade win big somewhere else, but the losers are completely abandoned by government policy. In fact, the authors draw a direct line from this exact policy failure to the intense rise of populism we've seen recently in places like the US and the UK. Now, what really explains this disconnect is something called the stickiness factor, and this is a crucial aha moment in the book. Traditional economists just assumed that if a factory closed in Ohio, workers would just seamlessly pack up and move to a new city to find a new job. But we aren't numbers on a spreadsheet. We are sticky. We stay in dying towns because our human fabric, our family, our friends, our community, our very identity is tied to that specific place. When standard economic models fail to account for this deeply human attachment, they fail entirely. That failure to understand basic human nature leads us perfectly into the next major concept: our political obsession with gross domestic product, or GDP. Every single election cycle, we hear politicians making these grand, sweeping promises about GDP growth. But the authors stop and ask a very necessary question. Is it finally time to stop treating GDP like the absolute only scoreboard that matters for a successful society? The myth we're constantly sold is that policymakers can just sit in some economic control room, pull a few magic levers, and optimize the economy for a neat 3% GDP growth. But Banerjee and Duflo hit us with a really hard reality check. Economists actually have no idea how to magically create growth. There is no magic lever. Furthermore, once a society's basic needs are met, GDP becomes a terrible proxy for actual human well-being. Blindly chasing growth at all costs can actively harm everyday people and the environment.
So, if we actually drop this obsession with GDP, what should governments be optimizing for? Well, the author suggests focusing on tangible things we can actually control and measure. We're talking about things like the quality of education, access to healthcare, reducing our carbon emissions, and ensuring human dignity and societal stability. Honestly, these are the metrics that actually change a person's everyday lived experience far, far more than a tiny fraction of a percent of national economic growth.
Speaking of carbon emissions, the explainer pivots here to an incredibly sobering look at climate change. It frames the climate crisis as the ultimate collective action problem. It's a problem that free markets, if left completely to themselves, are structurally incapable of solving. And it begs a really tough question. Can a democratic system, which operates on super short-term election cycles, successfully solve a problem where the highest costs are deferred for decades into the future?
So how on earth do we solve it? Well, Banerjee and Duflo argue that climate policy absolutely must not punish the poor. The burden of adjustment has to fall heavily on wealthy nations. Step 1 requires the West to meaningfully, actively change its consumption habits. And Step 2 involves using that reduction to create the ecological room necessary for the developing world to grow and lift its own citizens out of extreme poverty.
This whole question of who bears the burden leads right into the final major theme: inequality and our social safety nets. If we actually want to help people, we have to look at how we distribute aid. The authors ask, why do so many people inherently hate welfare systems? The sad reality is that traditional safety nets are often intentionally designed to be highly bureaucratic and humiliating. And it's all driven by this paternalistic fear that people are just out there trying to cheat the system. But here's the thing. The authors have spent years conducting randomized controlled trials. These are actual field experiments, not just armchair theories, mostly in the developing world. And their data on universal basic income and direct cash transfers is wildly counterintuitive to the traditional narrative. Direct cash transfers work remarkably well. People do not just blow the money on alcohol. Small cash transfers absolutely do not make the poor lazy. And on the flip side, high taxes don't stop CEOs from working hard. Across the board, purely financial incentives are massively overrated when it comes to how they drive human behavior.
So the crucial point is captured beautifully in this quote from the book. We need to respect the dignity of choice. In wealthy economies, the core issue isn't just about handing out money. It's about the deeper meaning and identity that is tied up in work. People want to feel useful. They genuinely want to contribute. A financial check gives them breathing room, sure, but it's the loss of hope, not the gain of a safety net, that actually causes a society to stagnate.
Ultimately, good policy requires facts, nuance, and above all, humility. It requires evidence over rigid ideology. As we wrap up this look into good economics for hard times, I want to leave you pondering this final provocative question. If we designed our economy around human respect instead of just cold numerical efficiency, what would actually change in your community tomorrow? Think about that and subscribe so you don't miss an episode.